intro to this, Gail was telling me about a new term, new to us anyway, called romantasy. Am I saying that right? Romantasy. So what can you just give us a little, like, how did you run across it, Gail, and what does it really entail? Because it's fascinating, I think.
For me, I thought it was the same thing as romantic fantasy, which is cool, but it seems to be much more of a romance and a fantasy setting, which of course is what I always thought of romantic fantasy. But romantasy, what it sounds to me, or I get the impression that the romance is the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started realizing that, gosh, I've been kind of writing that when I write my fantasies, because for me, the romance is the critical issue.
Mm-hmm.
It just happens to be in a fantasy setting. Now, I would think that there should be something in a romantic science fiction. We need a spiffy word for that too, because a lot of that is you can't really flow with romantasy like you can with romantic science fiction. What do you think the difference between romantasy and romantic fantasy, or is there one?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I think of immediately Outlander as something but that would be, that's sort of because there the romance is the main center of the story, the foundation of it. But you've got the time travel, the historical, trying to change history. I mean, to me, that's a perfect romantasy example. But I'm trying to think of other examples too. I think maybe the difference is romantasy, the romance is unapologetically front and center there, whereas maybe in romantic fantasy, I think they're probably just two ways of expressing the same thing, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that too, that there's not a huge amount of difference between one and the other, but they're just, people have the desire to label things maybe a little bit more precisely. And I really don't feel that there's a huge amount of difference between the two. But I like the idea of taking classic romances and put them in a fantasy setting. Like I've been toying with the idea of one of my favorite classics is, of course, Jane Eyre. And although there's a lot of issues in there that I didn't really recognize when I first read it, that kind of get on my nerves now. But put that in a fantasy setting with and do a gender swap has always been something that appealed to me as something fun to write. And of course, what jumps into your head, James Eyre, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I guess maybe the easiest definition is, if we're defining it by what it's not. So romantasy is any fantasy where if you take the romance out of the story, you don't have a story. Like, so for example, Lord of the Rings has some romantic elements, very minor. If you took those out of the story, it would not really affect much of the story. And
Outlander, as you were saying too, it is all the romance. I mean, the other things, the other trappings are there, and they're fascinating to look at, the time travel and the history, but without the romance.
I'm trying to think of another one besides Outlander that's just a perfect example of that. And obviously there are many out there. You have some writers who literally have a pen name for all their romantic fantasy versus their sci-fi, versus their sci-fi romance and that sort of thing too. It's interesting though that romantasy is a term, but like you said, there's no sci-fi version of that. Of course, maybe that's just because it would be such a mouthful.
So awkward to say, but they do have fantasy, science fiction romance, I think is considered a genre.
Oh, I did. Okay, I just thought of another one. A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. That trilogy, totally romantasy. I mean, it's paranormal romantasy basically, but romantasy.
Yep.
And so those are very popular. All right, I'm going to stop the video there just so that way Charlotte's not disoriented. So that's romantasy. That's our discussion of that for the day.